I'm going to talk a bit about two sort of idealized states of how a country or a society is run. There are two lots of authors who have written very similar narratives. There are some differences, but the major points are the same, so I'm going to treat them as if they're one. One is Douglas North and two of his colleagues who he's worked with for many years, Wallace and Weingast. Douglas North was an economic historian who won the Nobel Prize for Economics, and he is one of the fathers of new institutional economics. But when he was talking about the new institutional economics, various people said, but it's the politics that determine these institutions, and you haven't got a convincing story about where the institutions come from and why they come. Okay? And he seems to have spent quite a bit of time really getting into that as a result. The other two guys based in the States, Acemoglu and Robinson, who wrote a book called Why Nations Fail, which probably should have been called Why Nations Succeed as well, because it's the other side of the same coin. I'm not sure why the publisher thought it was better to emphasize the failure. Anyway, they both have these two stylized states. Acemoglu and Robinson, I'm using their terminology. They talk about societies characterized by exclusive institutions, and I'll explain that in a minute, versus inclusive institutions. And North and co talk about limited access orders and open access orders. And the same idea is at the heart of it is how many people are able to participate and gain from participation in the economics and the politics in these societies. Okay, so if we start with exclusive, and in both of these, the political and the economic institutions reinforce each other. Okay, and that's a key thing I want to convey today. And you either have a vicious circle or a virtuous circle. So in the vicious circle, the political institutions keep power in the hands of very few people, and they therefore deliver economic policies which give benefits to very few people, who tend to be themselves. Okay? And then because they gain all the benefits from the economic policies, this gives them the economic base to continue to sustain their political power, and so you keep going in a highly unequal system. In the inclusive institutions, or the open access orders, you have a very competitive politics, which means that if somebody tried to pass policies which will give benefits only to a very few people, they'll be voted out. So you have a reasonably even spread of economic benefits, and equally in turn, the fact that there's a very competitive market system means that there are always new industries that are popping up, and there are new people who can fund political challenges to the existing status quo. So if you've got people taking control of the politics, because you've got a very competitive market system, there are always new sources of funding for alternative political movements. So the competitive politics and the competitive economics reinforce each other in the inclusive institutions model in a good way, and the restrictive or exclusive political institutions and economic institutions reinforce each other in a negative way in the exclusive institutions model. Okay? Now, what these authors effectively claim is that every society in history has begun under what's either called exclusive institutions or limited access orders. Okay? And if we thought back in the UK case, if we went back a few hundred years, we would have a situation where you had the king, you had a very small number of nobles, they were on in the sort of 1600s, they were on an income of several £1,000s a year each, and then there's nobody except this sort of mass of a population at the bottom and a few artisans who have an income of a few pounds a year. Okay, a highly unequal society. Steve's laughing, but it's a very unequal society where a lot of wealth and power is concentrated in the hands of a few people. And the nobles basically were people who had the ability to have private armies, and they could defend their interests that way. And the king, therefore, had to sort of take note of what they were saying. It comes to a point where the king wants revenue from these people, and if they're not persuaded that the king's acting in their interests, they can say no. And our first sort of history of a parliament is the king wanting taxes for war and the nobles saying only under certain conditions. Okay? So 800 years ago this year we had the Magna Carta in UK, which was effectively nobles saying, if you want more taxes from us, then you've got to consult us. You've got to consult us first. And it was the first real sort of check or balance on the power of a king. Because that's what it looks like in UK, and we gradually get more checks and balances, and gradually, as part of those checks and balances, some of the key economic functions, particularly trading, get opened up at particular points in history, which mean that a new set of people get wealth, and those new set of people eventually say, if you want our taxes, we want some checks and balances on what they're used for, and they get brought into the political system. It's only in the last 100 years or so that actually everybody else gets a vote. Okay, so it's a long process, and it's a stepwise process, and it's quite gradual. But these authors all both use UK as an example of that transition from the exclusive institutions to the more inclusive ones. And the critical thing that North and Co. add, which is worth mentioning, is that you have some sort of elite agreement to limit violence. So you have to imagine you have a country which is not governed by the rule of law. And so the way that you keep peace is that the people who have the power to disturb that peace are brought into this elite agreement and given something that keeps them happy. So it makes more sense for them to abide by the agreement than to break it. And so what you do is you create these policies which give them huge benefit streams. Okay? So Lord so-and-so, you can have this whole part of the country and you can collect all the taxes there, etc., etc. Go away and that will keep you quiet. Okay, you can have access to this royal forest, you can do this, you can do that, and they get their rents, which satisfies them. And if they decide that they're not getting their share of the rent, they have a choice of two things. They can either raise their army and fight, in which case the outcome is a bit uncertain and it will certainly be costly in the short run, but they may get a better share of the benefits in the long run, or they just stick with the agreement that there is. But critical to it is that there are huge benefits for the people with power, and that's what's at root makes these sorts of societies highly unequal, and that inequality is deliberate. Okay, we look at it and we think, oh, that's a shame, I wish we could do something about that. But it's part of the design, okay, of the keeping the peace. When you don't have the rule of law and everything else, you pay people, the people who can do you the damage, you pay them off. And ultimately, that's not great for economic outcomes. A few people do well, but other people don't do so well. And that key thing that this inequality is almost part of the design is really important. Now let's look at the other one. Remember, these are two types. We haven't talked anything about how you get from one to the other. We just talked about what the two types look like. So the other ideal model, as I've already said, you have a much more competitive politics, and this is sustained by a market economy. So that people who try and either use violence or even limit competition for their own benefit can get voted out. There are multiple sources of capital to finance new political organizations if people think that they're losing out. And as part of the historical process, there are multiple checks and balances. So how on earth do you get to this situation, given that you started in the exclusive institutions one? Over time, as the few who are benefiting from this, over time, there are reasons why they decide they need a bit of support from other people. And the other people, when they come in, say, well, we're only coming in if you accept some checks and balances on what you do. And a lot of the great institutions that are about accountability and about transparency aren't because somebody said it would be a good idea to do this. They've been fought for by groups who wanted a share of power. Okay, and it's been a historical and political process. What these authors say is that most countries are somewhere along the transition from one of these to the other. I gave you the UK example. It took centuries in UK. Hopefully in most other places it can take generations rather than centuries. But a key thing is that those in power, remember they have the political power and the economic power, they hold all the cards. Okay? And it's in their interest to keep those cards because they're benefiting from it. Okay, so the notion that in the interest of being public-spirited, they're going to give away their power and do things which will benefit everyone else and not them is a little bit naive. And there are many historical examples. If you wanted to read Why Nations Fail, they have chapters and chapters of historical examples of where those with power opposed the necessary changes that would spur growth or make growth more pro-poor. Okay, not everybody is interested in pro-poor growth. So the question is, why would they choose to accept other people sharing their power or checks and balances on how they use their power? And at some level, at some points, they have to perceive reform as being in their interest. Okay? Now we're talking the high-level historical process of economic development. We're not talking about agricultural policy, but I think that principle is something that we can also think about in our much lower level. Okay? People with power have to somehow be persuaded that this course of action is in their interest. And historically, the two things that have really helped are competition between nations or between elite groups within a nation. Let me talk about those first. Competition between nations is a really important part of the story that's often told about the UK. And particularly, UK was often at war successively with the Dutch, followed by the Spanish, followed by the French over a period of several hundred years, and it went on and on. And when the king initially needed taxation to go and fight his battles, the nobles started to say, well, hang on, only if we get consulted first. And jump forward a few centuries to sort of when the Queen Elizabeth was queen, that sort of time in the 16th century. England was broke as a result of a civil war. Then there was a big competition between the Spanish were the main rivals at that time, and opportunities for trading elsewhere, but naval battles. There was nothing in the coffers of a British treasury, and we needed a navy. We used half of them were sort of legalized pirates, okay, who we gave the jobs to. Yeah, you can be part of the British Navy, but they were effectively pirates. But no, come on, be part of the British Navy. And then they still needed money for the navy, and the question was, how do we raise the taxes? And the conditions were, we want you to remove the trading monopolies that the Crown has, that the royal family has, over trading of key commodity chains. And you started, therefore, to get an opening up of naval trade, and a whole set of new people started making money and became a new interest group who gradually forced more opening in the economics and the politics. So the competition between the nations forced the king to depend first on the nobles and then on the middle class. Often if you have competition between elite groups, in their bid for power, they think, well, actually, we need to reach out to other parts of society and get them on board. And what are they going to offer them? Okay? And what are those groups going to require in exchange for their support? So these are things that can cause the people who hold all the cards to actually really let go of a bit of their power. And crises are really important as part of this story. when those in power completely run out of money, or when they're under a military threat that they think they can't survive without major changes. And suddenly they have to think about doing different things differently, finding new sources of support, bringing other people in. Then crises are an important part for change. So the history, if you want to talk about sort of economic and political development over time, is not like this, of great progress. It's, I don't know how I project this, you do well for a while, then you hit a crisis, and that spurs something new, and then you hit another crisis, and then you start doing something new again. It's a very, what's the word? It's not a continuous process, it's a very discontinuous process. And there can be periods where there are really no major changes in significant economic policies. There's tinkering at the edges, but the rules of the game basically stay as they are. And you hit a crisis, and then you get a significant change. And that's something we will talk about later. We're going to talk about windows of opportunity. Okay? But they only come up at certain points. And it's when the people with the power who have the vested interest in the current system see that, okay, there's a benefit in changing it. Now, reforms, first of all, those with power have to be persuaded to give it up. And those who are benefiting from the current system have to be persuaded or forced to accept changes which might bring benefits to others. So there has to be a sort of coalition of people who are campaigning and fighting for the reforms in the first place, but once you've even got them, they have to be enforced or sustained. When King John 800 years ago signed the Magna Carta, about a year after he signed it, he felt more secure and he said, not dealing with that anymore, that's far too many restrictions on my power. And actually, it was a few years later when his son, I think, became king, that actually his son was in a much weaker position and his son was persuaded to accept this charter. They still had a copy left. This is what your father signed. How about you take this on as a way of gaining the nobles' support for power? So unless people are willing to keep insisting on it, you might think you've made a breakthrough and it's actually reversed, and we all know that there are policy reversals as well. And so what I'm talking about at a high level, I hope you can relate to at the level of a sector as well. Okay, so the big sweep of history is a story of some progress but no real change in the rules of the game, then a crisis which leads to something new, which hopefully leads to a bit more progress, but then you have a bit of stagnation and a new crisis. Each time there's a crisis, you may get some new rules of the game, which might affect how power is to be obtained or maintained and the limits on the behavior of those seeking power. And how those with power, the elites, behave, and whether or not the poor benefit tend to flow from these rules of the game. So that's real big picture stuff, but similarly, in our policy making at sectoral level, you can see that you have particular policies governing not necessarily the whole of the agricultural sector. Think about a commodity chain. Okay, it does well for a while. Then you can see that there are problems. You can see what you'd like to do. Their will to do anything about it is just not there. But then some sort of window of opportunity comes up, which may be a crisis or maybe a political change, and there's a chance for new policies, and the poor may or may not benefit from this more than they were before. So think about this discontinuous process of policy making. There's always groups who may be excluded from the settlement, only sustainable as long as they can't force their way back in. Okay, why, at this high level, why might those with power and influence, who are here calling elites, why might they adopt pro-poor policy and behave in a way that the poor benefit, and broad-based growth, support for smallholder agriculture, whatever it is we're talking about? And I've given you four major drivers, as I see it, from those historical experiences. They don't all have to apply, and rarely do they all apply. We've talked about competition between states and competition between elite groups. there may be a fear of revolt. If you can have a large-scale uprising and resistance to something, that may cause the elite to modify their behaviour. And in a slightly more sort of democratic way, if we can call it that, less of the violence, but in a sort of more of a democratic dispensation, it may just be very well articulated demand from poor groups. If I was to give you a story about the East Asian tigers, places like South Korea and like Taiwan, which grew very rapidly from the middle of last century and are amongst the very few countries that have achieved high income status. Acemoglu and Robinson, who I referred to, say, look at the countries who were considered the sort of elite, wealthy countries of the world 150 years ago, look at the ones that are there now. There's been very few countries that have moved into that club. That club looks pretty much like it did 150 years ago, but some of the few that have made that switch are these East Asian countries. There is a theory. It can be contested and people can put other arguments forward, but I find it persuasive. That in the middle of last century, you had a strong rise of communism in many parts of Asia. So China had become a communist place. North Korea had become a communist place. You look where, obviously South Korea faced a direct invasion threat and had the Korean War for a few years. Taiwan was actually the former government in Beijing or Peking, which was actually forced out and went and took over the island of Taiwan, never recognized by the Chinese government, constantly under threat. So what did these states need to do? What did the leaders perceive they needed to do? The leaders were not democratically elected, certainly not in the Taiwan case. They fled from mainland China and just took over the island. In South Korea, there were democratically elected government, which was overthrown by General Park, and he was therefore a military ruler initially. Now, what do these governments need to do? They need to be able to somehow defend themselves, and they need some resources to do that, so they need finance. So they decide they need economic growth. But also in their populations, there are large numbers of poor people, many of whom are rural, who can see the attraction of communism as something that could bring them benefits. And so they know that the growth that they generate has to be broad-based growth in order to establish their own legitimacy in the eyes of these people and to reduce the latent support for these people amongst those poor and particularly rural populations. So there's an element of this. If you get a connection between the external threat and the latent support internally, it's going to topple you. So very strong incentives to go not just for growth, to get resources for defense, but to go for broad-based growth so that you take your population with you and you stay in power. Now, let's turn to Africa. I'm going to moderate or nuance what I say in a minute, but let's start 15 years ago. Nicholas van der Waal wrote a book about African economies and the politics of permanent crisis. Okay, how had countries performed so poorly and yet the governments had still stayed in power? How could that be possible? And essentially, his arguments were that none of those mechanisms really operated. Okay, not in every country, but in many countries. Okay, there was no real competition between states. That was part of the Organization of African Unity's very initial decisions, was we're going to respect the integrity of our fellow states. We're not going to interfere there. In the one-party states, the elites had been... This is one I would question a bit, but the argument would go, there were not that many really influential people, and enough of them had been bought off by positions within governments, within essentially one-party systems, that they weren't fighting each other much. Poor groups, particularly in rural areas, too poor, too disorganized, too dispersed to have a real impact on policy making. This comes to the urban bias, which we'll talk about later. So none of those basic drivers of pro-poor policy existed. Van der Waal called these autonomous states. He talked of an elite of maybe a few thousand per country. Over his period that he was looking at was 70 to 99, I think, something like that, or maybe 79 to 99, who did largely what they liked. As structural adjustment came in, although it had lots of costs for lots of people, they made sure they had control of the budget process. They farmed out most of the development expenditure to donors and made sure that their security expenditures and their expenditures on their president and his entourage and the elite were largely protected. They gave jobs in state agencies, as I say, as rewards or as buying people off. Van der Waal argues that actually in the 30 years after independence, although the number of people in African state agencies with formal qualifications, degrees, masters, multiplied many times, he says the capacity of state agencies to actually do things went down because of the politicization at the top levels. And a vicious circle of a low tax base, hence little revenue for development, left to donors, hence a low tax base. That's his argument. We can debate elements of that. But let's see now where democratization is supposed to fit into that sort of theory. And essentially, it's stimulating competition here between people who now have to compete for power much more openly than they did before. Hopefully the level of competition between elite groups is heightened. And ideally, over time, the poor being numerous, they are able to articulate their demands and say, if you want our votes, these are the things we want you to do. Okay? That's a sort of theory of why it might lead to more pro-poor policy. Democratization was not fundamentally demanded by the poor. There were definitely examples where educated people were very dissatisfied with their governance, and donors also put some pressure on at a time when countries were financially in dire straits and needed additional external support. But the rural poor particularly remained uneducated, dispersed and unorganized, as they always had been. One of the reasons why Bates argued that policy tended to favour urban areas. And this is only going to change slowly, so we will hear of cases of some organisation, but as a general statement, this is only going to change slowly. And so actually, we haven't seen an awful lot of articulation of demand for better policy by poor groups yet. So there's quite a bit of evidence now, survey evidence, Afrobarometer and other things on what do people actually vote for. And it's a mix, is the basic finding. There's quite a lot of findings that ethnic affiliation remains very important in terms of people's voting patterns, even once you control for all sorts of other factors. There are plenty of local issues that people think, particularly when they're voting for an MP, that this MP will do better for our area than that person. They're not thinking about the big national things, which will probably make the biggest difference to the country. They might be thinking about what happens locally. One of the comments on the Tanzanian election last month was that the campaigning was on the basis of personality and local promises, and there was very, very little on sort of national policy issues. But there is also evidence that people do assess, and increasingly assess, how the government has performed over time. So if you ask people questions in an Afrobarometer style survey, what's your impression of how the economy has done over the last 5 years? Okay, rank that on a scale of 1 to 5. What's your impression of how well the government has managed its affairs? Scale of 1 to 5. People who are scoring well on that are much more likely to vote for the government even after controlling from all of these other things. So there is evidence that performance is important. It seems to be less important in rural areas than in urban areas where that analysis has been done. Urban voters weight that more highly. So this is actually quite good news, but it's still only one factor in the pot. And it tends to come the more rounds of elections you have, and people realise, last time I was given a T-shirt and I voted for somebody and then I remained poor for the next 5 years. I'm not going to give my vote away that cheaply next time. That there's a learning process with cycles of elections. And so you would expect over time for this to become more important, okay? But it's at best an indirect link to agricultural policy. And what we're seeing is it's not really associated yet with, as far as we can tell, direct demands for specific improvements in agricultural policy. That growth could come from anywhere. So what we have seen, Steve talked about this, there's been a reduction in taxation of agriculture. There's a paper by Robert Bates which suggests that this is linked to democratization. It has happened more rapidly or more thoroughly in countries where a higher proportion of the population are rural, where it's democratic. In situations where there hasn't been democracy, a higher proportion of the population are rural has been equated with higher taxation. Okay, so there's some evidence there, but it also seems to me that quite a lot of it has just been donor pressure has led to this. But the critical thing is you can reduce taxation by a decision made in the capital city, and there's not an awful lot of implementation capacity that is required. It's a fairly easy thing to do. The things that are much more difficult are the things that require sustained public investment, working out what works, learning from your mistakes, doing it better, which could take you 5 or 10 years of consistently supporting and investing in something. And there's much less evidence of that having changed as a result of democratization. And investments in key public goods, particularly think about agricultural research or extension for a moment, may have long lags from the decision to implement to the benefits being seen, by which time the government who started the process is no longer in power. If I decide we're going to up the investment in a particular crop and variety, it could be a 7 to 10 year process of investing in that variety, testing it, taking it through the various trial phases. Eventually you get to a new release. You know, the government that funded that at the start is forgotten by that stage. And when the new variety comes, nobody knows which government to thank for it. Okay? And so there's at the moment not great pressure from democratization for these longer term investments. And we are getting, insofar as politicians feel we have to have something to offer to voters, we're getting a heavy emphasis on what we might call transfers. Input subsidies being a really popular example, trying to make promises about we will change prices in some way, even though markets are liberalised and the government doesn't have great control over prices, but there's still lots of promises on that. But a big emphasis on these things which are immediate and you know who's responsible and who you thank as a result of as a result of elections. What I'm going to try and do towards the end now is sketch through four countries and say something about the politics. I'm not sure how effectively I'm going to link all of that to agricultural policy in the time I've got, but hopefully it will be a prompt for questions. Now I'm going to use this as a way of saying, you know, where are our incentives for pro-poor policy in these countries if we look at it? Okay, and I'm going to say in Kenya, Tanzania and Uganda, of those four, really the only one which is at all effective, and you might question how effective it is the competition between elite groups. In Kenya, the way that you get power, or have got power, as a president, let's start with the president, is that you mobilize the votes from the different regions, and each region has a sort of regional champion who is quite influential in which way this region is voting, and you have coalitions of these regional champions who come together on the same ticket in order to support a bid for a presidency. And those champions, in due course, if they're successful, if they've brought in enough votes from within their regions using the various mechanisms that they have at hand, they tend to then receive various ministries as their reward for the support that they gave. And those ministries actually, I'm going to say historically, I'm going to say something that you may or may not find this very controversial. Those ministries are actually not so much, you're in charge of this national policy, you have this ministry, so there's a source of rent to make sure that you can keep your supporter base on side for the next time. Okay, and we saw over the years of the 2000s the number of ministries multiply. Okay, and the ministries becoming more and more closely associated with particular regions where they were the source of support for. You don't have to buy this fully. Okay, you can still say that there is a sense of national policy. I would question, and we'll talk about this in debate, to what extent there is a sense of national policy sometimes, but even if this is partly the case, you have to start thinking, what is the motivation at the highest level for what a ministry does? Okay, I'm talking here before the 2010 Constitution. We can discuss whether it still applies later. There's been a history of state intervention in agriculture because of the wonderful diversity of agroecological conditions in Kenya. There are a huge range of things that Kenya has grown very well, has quite a number of major commodity chains, but the particular commodity chains tend to be associated with particular parts of the country. So there's quite a close mapping between a commodity chain and the state agency, and the state agency can then become a source of rents for the people from that particular area. And they've particularly dealt with pricing issues, sometimes with input distribution issues. And often, particularly if it's pricing or input distribution, the people who benefit most are actually the people who produce the most, who are the wealthiest. So it's quite unequalizing as a way of distributing support within the country. And Kenya has a very high level of inequality both within regions and between regions. And this is not the entire story, but it partly helps to explain the persistence of that. If you start with unequal distribution of land, and then you're providing these supports through pricing to the people who produce the most, they get the most benefits from the support policy and they do better. And the people who produce least get the least support from it. And the other thing to say is, depending on who's in power, it depends which of these agencies have really been supported. So there was one set supported in the Kenyatta era, often focused on export crops, often focused on central province. Under Moi, quite a lot of those were allowed to decline, and other ones received much more of the support. So it may promote growth in a particular area for a particular period, but with a change of power, it can then be associated with a change of fortunes. Meanwhile, there's quite a weak set of incentives to invest in the national public goods, because so much of the attention is on distributing these rents to groups in particular regions. Kenya hasn't done completely badly with that, and one of the reasons I would say is that there's a lot of investment by wealthy people in Kenya back in Kenya. And insofar as they have businesses, they also understand that they benefit from some of these things. And they've benefited probably from agricultural research as well as from roads. So it's not a totally dire story, but it's not the best story. As an example, in the 2000s, there were 3 or 4 donor-funded projects all looking at how might extension be better provided in Kenya, which would be the perfect case to look at your different models that are being piloted, all associated with different donor projects, do a completely independent review, which one works better, let's take that on and scale it out. Okay, that's essentially what the Chinese do. They pilot things in different parts of the country, and if they spot that something works, they say, right, we're rolling that out across the whole country. But that didn't actually ever happen, that sort of review and commitment and scaling it out, because those incentives to invest in the national public goods were not that strong. We're going to talk about decentralization tomorrow and what that's done, because that has changed an awful lot of things. But there's been a real bias in policy in Kenya for quite a while. If you look at the strategy for revitalizing agriculture in 2004, this is not the set of priorities that were announced, but it's what still happens. If you look at the ASDS, this is not the set of priorities, but what actually happens compared to what's recommended is quite different. Tanzania. Have we got any Tanzanians in the room? We've got people who've worked in Tanzania, but not actually Tanzanians. Okay. If you were to try and say, what do we have to try and explain in Tanzania, you have one party which has dominated since independence, despite not delivering that much to many people in the population. Okay? Which is an interesting question. And it hasn't ruled by force. It's not it's not a sort of military security complex which is controlling Tanzania. And that's quite unusual for a single party to manage to achieve that for so long, particularly when it hasn't delivered as much as many people would want it to. So, a broad story at independence. There was actually not much of a struggle in Tanzania, much less so than in Kenya. And this very small party with very little capacity was suddenly given all the power in the country, having not really organised itself or mobilised itself, and without great capacity to take over a state. And you ended up with sort of quite a weak state from the start, because there wasn't much capacity that was coming in to run it. There were not many potential sources of opposition, because there hadn't been that sort of struggle against colonial rule which would have caused people to mobilise. One of the few potential sources of opposition, it was more potential than actual, was the cooperative movement, which had mobilised very effectively in parts of the country, including the Lake Zone. And it was feared that at some point they may not like the policies of the new government, and they had a reach of tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people in these areas. They could be a source of political opposition. So they were controlled politically. Their leaderships became political positions in the first decade so as to reduce any sources of opposition. Much more positively, whilst that was going on, a sense of nationhood was being built under President Nyerere, which I think most people say was a really great achievement. And in a way, the social and political achievement was much greater than the economic one. By the 80s, you had a real failure of the economic model. Steve showed how Tanzania sort of stood out a bit in some of the measures of distortions and the depth of economic problems they had. And this threatened the legitimacy of CCM at that point. And hence you got liberalisation and democratisation. But as part and parcel of that, you got a reinvention of CCM. And the absolutely critical thing, which people say that happened in this period, started under Mwinyi but much accelerated under Mkapa, was that business people who'd been really excluded under Nyererian socialism were invited into the party to be the people who funded the party's campaigns. And they were successful in doing that, in that they've continued to win all the elections. But the party has gone from something that really stood for something with a very clear ideological position to being more of an umbrella for anybody who was ambitious for power or wealth in the country. It no longer has a clear ideological position, but because it always wins the election, if you want to get power, what you do is you join CCM and work your way within CCM rather than go to the opposition where you're going to stay in opposition. So you get all sorts of people who are a mix. And CCM, it's not as if there seem to be very clear factions, but there are lots of people jostling for position and influence in the party. And this was felt to have really reached new heights in the past president's tenure. As part of this liberalisation and democratisation, you had a decoupling of the state from the party. The two had been almost inseparable, and they had power structures going from the central down to the village. And those two were decoupled, and actually a lot of the capacity went on the party side and not on the state side. And you still have, as evidenced by the elections last month, a party which is incredibly effective at reaching parts of the population that no other party can reach, and getting the votes out, but the state was left weak. And there is a continuing ambivalence towards the private sector, which some of us were discussing at lunchtime. So if you're an MP in the president's own party, it's expensive to campaign in Uganda, as it is in quite a few other countries in Africa. You get into government with a big debt. So either you need a position from the government, or you're willing to collude in certain deals in order to get the money to repay your campaign costs. And your ability, therefore, to hold the government to account for those scams is much reduced because you're part of them. Okay? This is a big issue in Ghana as well. Not necessarily the scams, but the high cost of campaigns and the need for position when you get to power in order to recover your costs. There's a very divided opposition. I'm sure the President had quite a lot to do with that. Not particularly credible alternative to voters. There's been some periodic harassment of the press in the past, leading to some self-censorship. So the press is quite lively, but actually there are limits to what it now says. There's a very high-profile, I think, Public Accounts Committee that makes noise every year about corruption scandals, but actually they don't turn into prosecutions. And the donors protest, but still often end up funding stuff. And anyway, oil is coming. So you put all of these together, and the accountability doesn't work as well as it ought to. Okay? So I haven't said anything particularly about agriculture because I'm afraid my sources didn't, but you can see that as a general environment for getting really progressive policy and pursuing investment in a particular area, it's not the most promising place to start. You may get a little flash of progress and be encouraged in a particular area, but then attention may move elsewhere and it's not followed through and really sustained. So I may be making claims there that are slightly unjustified, but that seems to be my reading of what is there. This is probably slightly unfair terminology here, but you'll see I'm categorizing Rwanda as having this additional incentive to what I've put for the other countries. And actually, although we haven't got an arrow this way, we've got an arrow this way, I'm going to say that there's quite a lot that I see that are similarities between Rwanda and the East Asian economies. And I would also say I see a certain amount between Rwanda and Ethiopia here, although I'm not going to present Ethiopia. There are various ways of trying to explain the real motivation of President Kagame and those close to him post-1994. And because I haven't interviewed him or anything, I can't absolutely say what they are, but there are various ways of expressing essentially the same ideas. There's clearly a sense that we should never let this happen again. There's also a sense that the Tutsis are a minority, relatively small minority in the country, and if you want to establish a secure future for this group, you've got to avoid the cycle of periodic terrible crises. Okay, the only way to guarantee their safety, given that they're the smaller group, is to get out of this cycle of crisis and conflict, and the way to do that is to get wealth for all, so that everybody has a stake in wealth and something to lose from there being a crisis. Okay? So although even if your incentive is to look after your own group, the logic of it is we do this by giving prosperity to all. If we give prosperity to our small minority group, eventually there's going to be another uprising and another crisis. So the only way to do this is prosperity for all. There is an expression that when the going gets tough, the tough get going. And the other element of it, which I would not in any way deny, is that there's then very visionary leadership. I don't think, you try and put yourself in the position of people in charge of Rwanda after the genocide. How do you improve the situation with the challenges they face? And you need people who've thought about this incredibly clearly and incisively. And I think that's also there. Some people attribute everything to that. What I'm going to argue is I don't think it's entirely personality. There are circumstances which compel a sort of logic to what has happened. When there has been a crisis, you find that others are more willing to follow somebody who's plotting a clear lead. And it also makes it easier to get support. So if you are heading the RPF and you're asking all the people around you to make sacrifices, we're now in power, but we are not going to use this just to benefit ourselves. We're going to hold off from that and we're going to go for broad-based growth. Okay, you're asking the people closest to you to make sacrifices. It's easier to do that when there's been a crisis than in the good times. Anyway, the combination that has emerged is a degree of political control. If I want to be completely neutral and unbiased about that, I can cite all sorts of international indicators on democratization where Rwanda doesn't score particularly highly. Effectively, what happens is if you're suspected of being somebody who will come in and campaign on ethnic lines, you are prohibited from standing in the first place. So there's a exclusion for certain people who can participate in the politics and who can't. If you're in and you're willing to play by the rules of the game, it is actually quite free. But there are some quite strict barriers to entry on the nature of which you will campaign. So, but whilst they're emphasising this, they are clearly also going as fast as they can for broad-based growth. For the reasons I said earlier, the way to prevent a return to conflict is to ensure that as many people as possible in this country benefit from prosperity and have too much to lose from going back to a time of conflict. This broad-based growth can establish legitimacy, and again, as in the East Asian case, insofar as there's latent internal sympathy for rebels who are still active over the border in eastern Congo, who are still very much a threat. If you want to remove internal sympathy for their cause, you make sure that your population as a whole benefits from what you're doing. You've got to somehow shift your politics from an ethnic-based politics to an issues-based politics and show that you are the best people at delivering. And that's what the government is trying to do. And it's therefore a very highly incentivized state. It wants to make major changes to the well-being of the country as quickly as possible, the well-being of many people in the country as quickly as possible. Its interest is in the outcomes, not just in retaining power. Okay, the interest of the government is not just, can I survive the next election? It's taking a longer-term view of that. Our way of having long-term security is by completely transforming the lives of the people in our country, and we may also transform the politics by doing that. So they are very focused on outcomes. They have we'll talk about this in the case study. They have revisited all of the sort of institutional arrangements in the policy-making process to see that we are equipped to deliver. They make quite a lot of mistakes. This is one of the problems of being a government with political control that's in a hurry. They tend to act first. But they do then learn and they correct. Okay? And in the textbook, if you go back to our policy-making process we had before lunch, the feedback loop is absolutely critical. And in many countries, that feedback loop is very weak. In Rwanda, that feedback loop is very strong. everything is assessed for its outcomes, and if it's not working, how do we do it better? And one of the things they learnt was that initially, for reasons which can be debated, there wasn't particularly high priority given to agriculture. In the first 5-6 years, it was all about just establishing peace and security in the country. In the next 5 years, from 2000, although agriculture was in their vision strategy as one of their priorities, it wasn't emphasised. There was much more emphasis on social sectors, on ICT, and that was partly advice they were getting externally. Come 2006, there was one of the poverty surveys, and they found that poverty had not fallen anywhere near as much as they expected. And one of the lessons learned from that was that's because the people who are still coming up as poor are people who are in the agricultural sector, and we have not been investing in it. And there's been a complete transformation of policy since about 2007. And because in Rwanda, they're not worried about the next 5 years, they're worried about the 15, 20-year scenario and the long-term change. They've got this medium-run perspective, but they're in a hurry to achieve big changes, is the sort of ideal scenario for public goods investment. Public goods may not deliver you the best return in 5 years, but over 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, they're by far the most efficient way of getting growth. And that's the perspective of the Rwandan government, which has invested quite heavily in terracing on farms, in reclaiming areas for irrigation, in services of all sorts to not just to agriculture, but to other sectors as well. There's been quite a heavy investment in public goods there. And what I want you to take from this is, this is, in a way, their policy is almost, I won't say textbook, but if I wanted to say what I thought was a great agricultural policy, I would look quite closely at Rwanda as a great example. But there are very specific conditions that have facilitated that. And if you're looking in Kenya, there may be things you can learn from Rwanda, and we'll talk about that, but also look at countries where the political and economic conditions are a bit more similar to those where you're starting, and see what is possible in those contexts. This is my last slide. So in terms of lessons from this session, I've talked about long-term processes, but I think quite a lot of the things that are true at the long term are also true at the sectoral level. And there are some general conditions which, I put this in because there will be exceptions, but there are some general conditions which will not change soon. And when we think about policy and we think about what traction we can get on policy, I'm going to put forward smallholder farmers are not organised to demand change and better policy yet. In general, with the exception of Rwanda in the countries I've talked about, for those historic reasons, there's fairly low capacity of the state to deliver services. I would say that means that if you want change, you're going to see it in particular areas where you can get a high-level political commitment to see change through in that area and build the capacity you need to deliver the services. If you can't build that capacity, you're not going to see the change. So you'll see it in pockets first. There has been this political preference for price policies and subsidies over longer-term investments. As a general trend, I think that will be true for the next few years. Again, we may find one or two areas of variation from that. We may be trying to promote some of those ourselves. If you have low capacity of the state to deliver, you might find it much easier to get quick wins by going for subsidies than by trying to put in place new policies and services that you first of all have to work out what to do. You get it wrong the first time, you learn, you change it. You're already several years in before you've even worked out how to do it properly. Whereas you give somebody a voucher and they know straight away who's given it to you. And then I talked about the crises. Well, I'm going to say at sectoral level, we look for windows of opportunity for specific reforms. And the key requirement I'm going to emphasise there is where is there sufficient high-level interest, not just to get a change on paper, but to enable and ensure that there's implementation of that somebody's going to follow through for the time taken to actually ensure that things change. Okay, I'm going to leave that there.